Someone asked, what do I mean by subtle? It was such a good question. I've never had this question before. And of course, I really can't answer it with exact precision because it's too subtle, right? It's a pointer. Subtle in opposition to or in contrast to gross. That's what I'm pointing to when I say subtle. So much of what I'm pointing to when I'm talking about finding it in your experience, which I'm always talking about, no matter what kind of pointing I'm doing, I'm generally just pointing you back to your own immediate experience, but I'm pointing you back to the subtle aspects of your immediate experience. So subtle here is on a spectrum. Subtle meaning initially that which is not the gross, hypnotic, structured, stereotyped, ongoing thoughts. It's subtler than that. So what is subtler than all of those gross thoughts that seem so real, so structured, so predictable, so confining? Well, consciousness is. To look into the subtlety of one thought, or the experience of thought, or better yet, the experience of being the thinker, looking into the subtleties of that, into the texture of that, looking closer at that experience, is to direct your attention to the subtle. And the beautiful thing about this first aspect of the contemplation, this first part of that spectrum I'm talking about, is that the nature of consciousness is such that when you experience it directly, when you experience consciousness, conscious only of consciousness, that sort of unbound consciousness or pure consciousness, or probably the most accurate way I can say it is consciousness without an object of consciousness. When you experience that, even though it might feel like your entry point was something very specific, like one thought, one specific thought, even the I thought, to know consciousness in that discrete aspect is to know consciousness in the infinite aspect. That's the realization. That's the insight that comes, and it's such a like knock you off your chair kind of insight because it's just so surprising, you know? And when I say knock you off your chair, I know many, many minds are going to imagine something that feels like fireworks to them, that they want something big, something dramatic. No, it's subtle. But it knocks you off your chair because of its subtlety, of its simplicity, of its ineffability. It's a surprise. It's surprising. And it's also surprising that it was there for you the whole time. It was automatically, not automatically, but habitually, through the habituated tendencies of thought, of thinking, it was overlooked. So it was habitually overlooked, not automatically, but it's almost automatic. Those mental processes get a momentum to where it seems like there's an automatic experience of the gross world of thought, but it's not quite automatic. There's a little bit of effort sort of pushing that machinery. And when you see that closely enough and you're able to stop for a moment, when you're able to, when you're able to feel the discomfort of not grabbing on to the next thought, not adding will to the thinking experience, when you're able to just stop for long enough, then the subtle becomes so obvious. That which is subtle is so enjoyable, it's so beautiful, so precious, so simple, so immediate. It's just this wonderful conscious experience without having to make it into anything at all, without having to make it into time, a story, self and other, internal dialogue, judgments, contemplation, rumination. All of that is just completely unnecessary because all of those are just iterations of this purity of subtle consciousness. So this is subtle, right? This is the subtle realization or the realization of the subtle in consciousness. Now, what's interesting about this is that you'd think that's as far as it could go in a way. When that's realized, for some people, it's so astounding and it's so available all the time. And it's in a lot of ways so peaceful. It's like kind of the home you can always return to through meditation, through samadhi, through sometimes just reminding yourself of it. And then, not grabbing onto thought, not getting on the thought train, not believing any thoughts of division or separation or anything. It's revelatory for sure. And often it feels like nothing could be more true. Nothing could be more real than this. Nothing could be more primary than this. But what's interesting, and there was a comment recently, someone said, when I talk about no self, this commenter said that the way I'm talking is directly in contradiction to their own direct experience. Let me be precise about this. What they said was, when I talk about there not being anything moving from moment to moment, which is very, very obvious that there isn't with no self-realization. It's super obvious. There's nothing in continuity. There's literally just nothing moving from here to there to there. There's nothing holding experience together. There's no collating substance or force. It's so obvious. But they said that's in direct contradiction to their experience. And their experience they described as a sort of wholeness that they described as an all-encompassing, all-accommodating wholeness that they described as capital S-E-L-F, the self. This is how a lot of Advaita Vedanta teachings refer, right, to the self with a capital S. And they said that experience, and it is an experience, is in direct contradiction to what I said. And I know it is, and they're right, it is. So the question is, which one's right? Well, I would say they're both right in their own right. They're both right at that stage of realization. But what I will say is, and this links directly to what I was just discussing, this feeling of like the entirety of that experience of what I call consciousness. Other people may call it a self with a capital S. Some people would call it the I am sense. But I call it, I would just use the term consciousness because essentially that's what it is. It's the reflective capacity of mind, nothing else. You can experience it as this pretty incredible fluid experience that encompasses all and excludes none. And that's true. It's true. But the conclusion that that's the final realization is just not true. I know this directly. I know this through experience, but I also have interacted with many people who've gone through that barrier as well. One question that arises is that final shift available to everyone? I think it is available to everyone if they're really inclined to dig into it. But some people seem to, for a while, I don't know if I would say they're not ready or they're just not, the conditions aren't set up for it. They're not inclined. I'll say that. They're not inclined to continue to dig or to inquire or to really look even closer at presence and see, is this experience of unity, consciousness, wholeness, beingness, infinite being, is that the final truth experientially? And if you look closely enough, you'll see it's not actually. And if there's a word that I could use to tell you what is going to lead you into that kind of looking, is looking at the subtle. It gets very subtle, far more subtle than the difference between sort of gross thought and consciousness. The difference itself is more subtle. So it's much more easy to overlook. In the past, I've said, you wake up, you have an awakening. It's a tremendous shift for many people, for most people. And for everyone at some level, it's the most fundamental transformation possible because that's at the level of identity, even if it's not a big deal experientially. It is a big deal existentially. So even though that's a really significant deal to have that first shift, and I definitely have run across people who really believed that was it. There's nowhere to go beyond that. It doesn't get any more awake than that. And it's kind of like, awakeness, asleepness, it's all sort of the same thing now. So there's no beyond this, right? And you'll see that around if you watch, videos on YouTube about non-duality and stuff. But what I've said is that's what I call Kensho, or first awakening, or Satori. It's like waking up from the Matrix, right? That you've heard this analogy. But I've also said you don't often realize you're in a different kind of matrix now. You wake up from one matrix and you realize that matrix was in a different kind of matrix. And I could say the matrix that you're in now is a sort of bigger matrix, but bigger maybe isn't the right word. It's more subtle. It's more accommodating. It's more fluid. It has a different set of rules as far as it's not like actual rules, but it has a different set of rules as far as how it functions and feels, and how to inquire into the nature of it to dispel the deeper fixations, the deeper perceptual illusions. And again, a guidepost or guiding sort of principle is to look into the subtlety. And that's why I start pointing people at this point to the sense fields. And the sense fields in association with, or even in contrast to, awareness. These are subtle inquiries. That's why my playlists have very specific types of pointings that are like very direct and very precise about one particular thing, especially in the non-dual playlist and the no self playlist. Now, if you haven't had a shift of any kind, then I don't recommend those necessarily. I recommend the Basics of Awakening or Awakening Approaches playlists for this reason, because it's so subtle you can overlook it easily. So the subtle now is really your attunement all the time. And it becomes so beautiful because then presence itself, what we call presence, the subtlety of it becomes the loudest thing. The subtlety of it, the unborn nature of it becomes so prominent, so enticing, so interesting. It's as if all of these are analogies, so take them lightly, hold them lightly, because if you try to recreate them with your mind, that's not what I'm trying to get you to do, because that'll just add another layer of thought or another belief. But if anything resonates in your own experience, and your own experience sort of illuminates by hearing this, go there. Go to your experience, right? So it's as if, although you're aware of the grossness of what appears to be a physical world, three-dimensional world, or even the grossness of thought, like time, beliefs, the memory that person did this or said that, like that feels really real. My memories of who I am and where I came from and where I'm going, and my spiritual world and my spiritual, whatever, catalog of experiences and all of it, that feels very real to me. It feels very solid. I get it. All of that is in experience, right? And that's okay. It's almost though as if something becomes very still, such that it attunes to a subtle resonance that's coming through all of that, coming through it. It's not that. It's not the grossness. It's not the illusion, but there's something coming through even in the illusion. There's a subtlety. I can use poetic terms like the unborn. The unborn is radiating from everything, but there aren't things. It's not through a believing the illusion of separation of subjects, objects, time, space, narratives, judgments. It's not through believing them, but even in the sort of channels that seem to be picking up those illusions, you see the radiance of, you experience, hear, feel the radiance of the unborn. It's the subtlety that is you're reattuning to. It is the subtlety that you're reattuning to. I hesitate to use terms like nothingness or no-thingness, or the nothing or the void, but those have a place because what they're doing is they're reattuning your attention from the gross, from that which just seems so obvious and so real when we're mind identified. And as the mind identification spell breaks, we're so disillusioned because it's just so not real. So then what do we attune to? And you can get into kind of a disassociated space with that. It can be very disorienting at times, right? But what happens is you start to actually attune to the subtle. You attune to the subtle, and then the mind doesn't have a job here, like the conceptual mind, the dividing mind, the discursive thought machine. It just doesn't have a job here. So it can just settle down. It just calms down. And the attunement to the subtle is everything. Everything that it's just this one sound. It's just this one visual experience. But it's non-dualistic, so it's not experienced somewhere or by someone or even in some time or space. And subtle attention, subtle discernment really helps you to see the difference between the experience of something moving through time, or actually there being a substance called time and space through which things move and evolve, including you. The subtle discernment will help you see the difference between that experience and the quote unquote experience of mere appearance with nothing before or after it, nothing supporting it, nothing eradicating it, nothing behind it. And another mere appearance. Again, unsupported, not anchored, not coming or going. And the mind would say, well, if there's one and then another, that would mean that there's something connecting them, there's something moving between them, or there's something in which they are appearing. Those are illusions. But it takes subtle discernment to see that until it's realized. With realization, it's rather obvious. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing because, again, subtle is hard to talk about because of its subtlety. But these types of pointings I try to give in your own experience are to help you attune to it. But once you get that, I've had people occasionally say this where they're like, oh my God, I finally know what you mean by subtle now. I'm like, yes, good. Because that can just be your attunement ongoing. Makes all of this so much easier when you realize what it means to attune to the subtle. So let me know how that lands, or if it does, or if it doesn't at all.